You know what this is? It's a huge pile of fabric that I have cut to make block number 2 for the Bliss quilt along. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video we are going to assemble block number 2 for the Bliss quilt along. This is a block of the month program that is included in Sew Sampler boxes that started shipping in April 2022 and will end in March 2023. It's free if you're getting the Sew Sampler box, but if you're not, you can still buy the pattern for each block for just a little under $5. And all of the information for the fabric requirements and the patterns and how you can buy them will be listed on my website, and I'll link to that page in the first comment down below this video. This is not my pattern, obviously, so I can't give you any of the cutting instructions. Instead, what I've done is starched, cut, and labeled all of my fabric according to what my block pattern says. So if you are doing this block with me and you have not done that yet, you might want to pause the video here, go press and cut your fabric according to what the pattern instructions say, and then come on back and we'll sew this together. There's a lot of little pieces here and I am ready to get started, so let's dive in. This is going to be the block that we will make, and these are all of the little pieces that we're going to use to make that block. I have said recently that I really enjoy my time using small pieces of fabric to do what I'm calling tiny quilting or tiny piecing. And I think we're going to be using some of those skills to make this block. Now, here's my big tip for you. You're going to want to starch your fabric. If you just are one of those that steam press or just hot dry press, maybe take a moment to apply sizing to all of your fabric before you start cutting it up and using it, because that's going to make it behave a little bit better when we sew everything together into our blocks. Step number 1 does have us working with some very tiny squares, but don't worry, you can do this. You're going to take all of your fabric B squares and you're going to take all of your fabric C rectangles, and we're going to use the stitch and flip method to apply each of these squares to 2 of the corners on our rectangle. So we're just snowballing 2 corners on the short edge of our rectangles. This is going to give us a unit that kind of is reminiscent to a flying geese. We're going to end up with a nice point right here. We're going to do that to all 8 of our fabric C rectangles. To do the stitch and flip method, we do need some sort of a guide to make sure that our needle is starting in the corner, ending in the corner, and it's going straight when we're not in either corner. You can use some diagonal seam tape or some other marking system that might already be on your machine if you'd like to, but for me, I'm going to use a marking tool and I'm going to draw with a ruler a line that starts in one corner and goes all the way down to the other corner. This is the marking on the fabric that I will use when I am stitching. I'm not going to stitch on this line. I'm actually going to stitch just one thread to the right of this line. So right next to that line. That's going to allow enough room for the thread that I'm adding into the seam and the fold to come over, and it should give me exactly what I'm looking for. I'm going to take all 8 of my rectangles and I'm going to position a little square in one of the corners so that the line starts in the middle-ish of this short edge and goes up to the long edge. I'm going to do that on all 8 of these. Then I will trim, press, and repeat for this corner right here. Got all of these stitched. Now I'm just going to come in with my ruler, my rotary cutter, and trim away these little pieces 1/4 inch away from that line that I just stitched. Now I'll take a little bit of time to press all of these out and open, because when we put the other square onto this side, it's going to overlap with this piece. So we need to make sure that this is pushed up and over so that we're making that flying geese type of a unit. Right now I'm just pressing them with my fingers because my iron is still heating up. I do want these to be really flat when I sew the other stitch and flip on. So I will apply a little bit of heat to get them to lay even flatter than what my fingers can get them to lay at. Since my iron is still heating up, I'll just arrange these so that I can hit all of them with one swoop of the iron. Just laying them out so that they're not on top of each other and they're all kind of exposed. And now I'll just come in and glide my iron over all of these flaps. Just like that. Now I'm going to repeat that step on the other corner. I just want to make sure that when I line it up, this square is in the opposite corner on the same short edge, and the line that I drew is touching here and touching here. Good thing I'm making videos because I don't have to come up with all the words. I can just show you what I'm looking at. Just like I did before, we're going to trim each of these little pieces a 1/4 inch away from my stitching line. And then I'm going to press these open just like I did before. Our next step is going to separate these into 2 piles of 4, and we're going to lay them out so that they're pointing towards one another, and we're going to take a seam right through here. Now, this can be a little finicky, and sometimes those points are not going to perfectly kiss or match up. They might have a little bit of distance between them, they might be cut off a little bit, or they might be askewed and gap or overlap. Don't stress too much about it. Trust me, I know from experience that when your quilt is all done, nobody's really going to see that. We followed the same process when we were putting together the flowers for the Springbrook Blossoms Block of the Month that was free from Corey Yoder back in 2021. And trust me when I say that when I did this, my points were not kissing. They were not perfect. They were kind of all over the place. But once that quilt was all put together and it's been through the wash cycle a couple of times, nobody's going to notice. When you take a step back and look at it, what you really see is the pattern that the fabric is making and the texture that the quilting is added. So just give yourself a little bit of grace, breathe, and you're going to be okay. Now, if you want to try to keep your points, this is something that you might want to consider pinning, and let me show you how I would pin it. This won't guarantee perfect results, but it should help improve them. I'm going to take the 2 pieces that I want to sew together, and I'm going to take a pin, and from the back side of one of the pieces, I'm going to put that pin just 1 thread to the right of that X intersection where my threads from my seams intersect. What you'll see is on this side, the pin is actually coming through on the white, not the green. So it's coming through on my little snowballs that I did on either corner. I'm going to put my pin all the way through so that the head is flush up against the fabric. And then I'm going to grab the next piece that I'm sewing it to. I'm going to poke my pin through that same spot on the other piece, right just above where that point is. And then I'm going to let it hang loose because that's going to let me adjust my fabric and line things up. And I'm noticing that these snowballed pieces here, the raw edges don't line up the way they should be if everything was perfect. But I know that this is a true raw edge and they are exactly the same size. So I'm going to make sure that this edge, and this edge are lined up, and I'm not going to worry too much about this. Then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 of an inch away on this short edge. But I want to make sure that as I'm feeding this through my machine, that my needle, when it gets to this pin, it is right at the pin or even just ever so slightly a thread or a hair to the right of it. And that's going to make sure that the point from both of these fabrics isn't chopped off. It might be floating a little bit. There may be a teeny bit of a gap, but I would rather have a gap than a chopped off head. So when I'm sewing this, I hold the pin and I push the fabric down onto the machine and I measure the 1/4 inch from the thickest fabric. So the one that's a little shy is not where I'm measuring my 1/4 inch. It's going to be the bigger fabric. And I'm just going to go really slow. I'm going to use my pin to hold the fabric together. I'm getting to the point where the needle is touching the pin, and I'm just going to stop, pull that out, and then finish sewing the seam. This process is a little finicky because it takes a little extra time to pin and make sure everything is lined up right. But if you do that, you're going to get a little bit better results. The instructions do say that we're going to press this open. So let's take this to our mat. We're going to put our finger in between these seams, and I'm just going to run my fingernail along that seam. And I haven't even looked to see if my points are perfect yet or not. I hope they are. We're going to leave it if they're not. Let's flip her over and see what we've got. That's not too shabby. So I'm just going to set my hot dry iron right on top of this piece, make it really nice and flat. And if I'm really worried about extra bulk, I can always bring in a clapper to really make that lay even flatter. I'm not going to do that now, but I will probably do it when the block is all done. We're going to repeat that same step for those other 3 pairs. Now I've got all 4 of these built together, and honestly, this is probably the most finicky part of the block. It really is a little fussy, and you are going to have to take your time with it. But if you do everything well, you should have kind of like this little hourglass shape happening right here. The next step wants us to take our fabric D and our fabric F squares, and we're going to cut them on the diagonal both ways so that we're making 4 1/4 square triangles. That's what they call the triangles that are made when you take a square and cut it on the diagonal once and then twice. You get 4 triangles, so 1/4 square, 1/4 of a square triangle. No marking required, just lay your ruler on top of your fabric, making sure that it goes corner to corner, slice through, do the same thing on the other, and very gently lift this off. And because I am using a mat that I can just rotate, I'm just going to turn this 90 degrees, and then I will, oops, I didn't mean to move that, but I will lay my ruler on top of the square going in the opposite direction, corner to corner. I will slice through that, and I will do the same thing over here. And now I've got 4 little triangles from each block that I can separate out. See what I did there? 1/4 of a square triangle. You get it now. I'm going to set those off to the side, and now we're going to grab our fabric H squares. There are 2 of them, and we're just going to cut these on the diagonal once. And this is what's known as a half square triangle because it's half of a square and it's a triangle. We are cutting our square in half on that diagonal to make a triangle. Just like that. Now we're going to move on to the next step. And the next step is going to build up 4 units exactly the same way. We're going to take these triangles that we cut out of fabric H, and we're going to lay them out so that the long edge is kind of pointing up to the right, and the 90 degree that we have left is pointing down and to the left. Then we're going to take our fabric D triangles, and we're going to lay it out so that the long edge is along the top edge of our block. The short edge is matching up with the long edge of our fabric H triangle. And then we're going to take our fabric B triangles, and we're going to set it up so that the long edge is on this side or this edge of our square, and it's kind of just pointing right in there. Now, when you're looking at it, it doesn't necessarily all match up because we haven't taken our seam yet. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is take our seam right here on all four of these, and then we can either press that open or to the side. The directions actually say to press open, and I think that's probably your best bet in this case. And then we're going to sew this to this and press that open as well. So let's go take our seams here. We are matching up our short edge of all of these triangles with fabric F on the bottom and fabric D on the top, and our 45-degree long biased edge is down this way. You'll want to make sure as you're sewing that your fabric is oriented the right way on all 4 of these. Otherwise, you're not going to have the fabric placement the way the pattern wants you to. The instructions said to press these open, so we're going to open up the seam, hold it a little taut with our fingers, and run my fingernail right through that seam that we just made. It's going to put the cream fabric behind the cream fabric and the blue behind the blue. Pressing this open is going to help our block lay a bit flatter, and it's also going to help keep darker fabric from showing behind lighter fabric. All right, before I sew these to the next piece, I am going to heat set that seam. Want to be really flat. Now I'm going to pair up these units that I just made with my fabric H triangles, and we're going to sew them on that long edge that we have going corner to corner on both of our units. And again, for these, we're going to press them open. So I'm going to lay it down so that the seam is on top. Hold either end with my fingers and just run my fingernail right through the seam to get it to lay open. And then once I have done that for all 4 of these pieces, I'll get my iron and really have it come in and make this lay nice and flat. Now, because I've taken a couple of seams on all of these little pieces and things can be a little finicky, I'm going to stop and trim up or square up all 4 of those squares according to what the pattern says. Plus, that'll also get rid of my dog ears. And boy, am I glad that I squared those up, because all of this was excess that was going to make my block wonky. If I would have left all of this attached to each of these pieces, I wouldn't have been able to get everything to lay nice and flat. I would have had to ease stuff in, and so I could have ended up with a wavy block. So taking the time to square that up was absolutely a brilliant idea. What I did do when I was squaring this up is I made sure that the exact center of my measurement was right on this seam. So for example, if this was a 10-inch piece, I was making sure that the 5-inch mark of my ruler was right on that seam, and then I was squaring everything up according to what my pattern said to square it up to. We finally have all of the pieces that we need to put our block together, but fabric placement is going to be very important. So make sure that you are paying very close attention to how your fabric layout should be. So I'm going to put this down on my pressing mat so that I can see what the block should look like. The block is facing me, so it would be upside down for you. And we're just going to set this up so that we're building almost like this little friendship star diagram. And I think that's right. I'm going to double check this before I do anything else. According to the pattern, I should have fabric H all touching in the middle, and it should be spinning in this direction. This one's pointing down, this one's pointing here, this one's pointing up, and this one's pointing up. And then I just want to make sure that my fabric B is on the outer edge of the block. I'm sorry, that's D. Fabric D is on the outer edges, and then this fabric F is kind of nestled right in here. That's right. Then we're going to take our fabric E squares and put them in the 4 corners, just like this. And then we're going to take our fabric G, which apparently I have cut 4 of and I only needed 1 for, but we're going to put our fabric G right in the center, just like that. We're going to sew this row and this row together, and the seams are going to press away from this quarter square triangle unit that we made in the center of each of the rows. Then we're going to sew this row together, and the seams will press in towards this center square, and that's going to allow all of these seams to nest up really nicely when we put this block together. We are almost done. This is what our block looks like right now, and we're going to take these little units that we made in the beginning and lay them out on all 4 sides of the block, just like this. And then we're going to take our background squares that we have left and put them in the four corners of our block. And just like we've done before, we're going to make this row, this row, this row, and then sew those rows together. Whew. Let's do it. It says for the top and bottom row, we're going to press our seam underneath that green fabric. So I'm just going to finger press this where I want it to go so that I'll remember for later. Do the same thing to the bottom row while I'm thinking about it. Make sure that we're doing everything the right way. It's fresh in my memory, so I'll do it now. I'm going to finger press it underneath that green stripe. So now our top and bottom rows are pieced. We just got to build this middle row, and we've got to be a little careful when we do it to make sure that we're not losing our points from our star. So for that reason, I'm going to lay my row that I made, my little side piece, on top of the block, and then I'm going to stitch it from the back because I can see where my line of stitching is here, and I can see where that seam is where I press this open. And as long as I stay just a thread to the right of where that intersects, it's kind of hard to see in camera, but you'll see it when you're working on your block. As long as I stay just a thread to the right of that intersection, I should be okay. Go slow if you need to. If it helps you to pin it or mark it with a fabric marker, do that too. And there's our middle row. I'm going to give all of this a good press with just a hot, dry iron. I'm not going to worry about starch or anything just yet. I'm just getting these seams to lay a little bit flatter so that when I put the rows all together, it's a little bit easier to feel where things are nesting. So I'm going to take this top row and lay it on top of the middle. I'm going to nest up the first seam with my fingers, and I'm going to stitch right until my needle is in that seam. Then I will stop, pause for a second, line up the next seam that I want to nest, which is all the way down at the bottom, and I'm going to hold it with my fingers, and I'm just going to stitch all the way down. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. Stitch until the needle is in that seam. Pause and adjust my fabric so that the next seam that's on the table is nested up nicely. And I'm going to hold this just to keep the fabric from shifting, but I'm going to let the machine pull everything through. There we go. The instructions want us to press towards the top and bottom of our block. So I'm just pressing this from the back to get the seam to lay flat. I'm going to give it a little tension on the fabric just to make sure that this seam doesn't have any tucks or folds in it. Then I'm going to flip it over from the front. I'm going to smooth it out with my hands to make sure everything feels good. And then another hot, dry iron press just to get it to lay the way I think it should be laying. And then the last step is to give it a good steam press or starch press or both, and then square it up. There's so many little pieces that have gone into this block that the best way to get this block to lay flat is to apply some steam or some best press or both, and then let it cool underneath of a clapper. And I have got a huge clapper that we're going to use on this block. So a generous supply of best press, a metric ton of heat, and then the world's heaviest clapper right on top of the block. And then I'm just going to let my clapper sit there and do its job. What a clapper actually does is it applies pressure uniformly to your seam so that after you've put heat on your fabric to reset the fiber, it allows the fabric to cool in the flattest position possible. We all know that cotton fabric has memory to it. And so those fibers like to remember where they were supposed to be and they go in that direction. And the best way that you can reset it is by adding moisture and then heat and then allowing the fabric to cool from that heat in the position you want it to be in. That's why we use clappers or other heavy objects to set on our seams when we're done pressing because it makes sure that they stay as flat as possible. And that's our block. Because of all the time that I took to press this, it's like a sheet of paper. So this is our block. It should square up to 10.5 inches when it's all done. I'm going to take it over to my cutting table, square it up, make sure that everything looks good. I had a lot of fun putting this together. It was definitely a finicky block, and I'm a little scared to see what the rest of the blocks are going to be like for the Bliss Quilt Along, but I am up for the challenge, and I hope you are too. Thanks so much for sewing with me, friends. I'll see you guys all next week when we tackle block number 3. Bye!